All right, we're ready to begin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending where you're joining us around the world. We are pleased to be back after the small summer break, and today is our first event. It will be, I think, a fascinating discussion on hot topic, whether we need phase 3 trials in oncology. We put together a wonderful panel for you, all of which is based in North America. So I will let all the speakers introduce themselves, and I wish you to enjoy the show. If you would like to ask questions, you can put them in the chat, and when I see your questions, I will communicate them to our panelists. If you would like to ask a question, joining the screen, and yeah, raise your hand so I can see you, and I'll invite you to participate. But we have a lot of different issues and very interesting issues to explore. So welcome to everyone. So today we have with us Dr. Marty Tannenbaum, we have Julian Adams, we have Ian Tanak, and we have Jonathan Kimmelman. So please, let's start with introductions. Marty, I invite you first to give a few words about yourself and a few words about Cancer Commons.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Greetings from California. I was lucky enough to be a computer scientist in Silicon Valley during the golden age of computers. I'm an AI and e-commerce specialist, an e-commerce entrepreneur, and then I learned about cancer the hard way by getting diagnosed with metastatic melanoma to liver. I was given 9 months to live, and that was 25 years ago. My life was saved by a clinical trial that failed. And when I got my health back, phase 3 clinical trial that failed, I might add. And when I got my health back, I decided to kind of give back because my own journey was marked by fear and panic and getting all kinds of conflicting information. Sometimes I was told there's no options. Sometimes I was told, well, you can try this trial that I have here. Take a flyer. There was no way to decide which one was right for me. And so I started an organization called Cancer Commons to make sure that no patient had to navigate the cancer journey alone. And over the last, and all of this, my cancer experience was 25 years ago. So over the last decade or so, we've helped over 10,000 patients who are dealing with advanced and rare cancers plot their own path. So with regard to clinical trials, I have, a kind of mixed view about them. On the one hand, they saved my life, and they are the gold standard in terms of evidence. On the other hand, there's a number of things that are problematic. They're not cost effective, very expensive. They are there's opportunity costs in addition. They don't make very efficient use of patients. Patients hate them for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into. So just very quickly, not cost effective. A phase 3 clinical trial run by a big pharma company with a CRO costs upward of $50,000 a patient and can take years to get information that Cancer Commons helps patients and collects real-world evidence to answer questions that we can answer for maybe $1,000 or $2,000 a patient using real-world evidence in a learning health system that's always learning from every patient. And so on the basis of that, we are able to learn far more now with the amount of money than running phase 3 trials. On the other hand, we aren't going to see very subtle changes, a few months of survival advantage after, say, 5 years. We won't see it, but patients don't care about that. And many physicians don't either. We're not interested in small changes. We're interested in home runs. What happened to that tumor that we saw last month after you got treated? And in this case, we're continuously learning. And I think that's more important. The other thing is that phase 3 trials are also opportunity costs. So phase 3 trials are about drugs, for sure. They're not about the patient. And the problem is that every cancer patient's thing is unique. So as a result, no one really knows the optimal way to treat any cancer with available drugs. There's not nearly enough patients on the planet to run phase 3 trials for all of these. And so nowhere is this more clearer than in pediatric oncology. A learning health system that's learning from every patient, which tightly integrates research and care, is the only way that we can learn how to use effectively the thousands of drugs that we already have. Because the optimal treatment almost always involves a combination of drugs. And finally, patients not being happy about trials. All of the things that patients do not like, inclusion-exclusion criteria, travel, randomized control arms. No patient wants to travel across the country for a trial when they have cancer, and they like it even less if there's a chance that they're in a control arm. And these things are, in fact, not necessary in the context of a system that's continuously learning from every patient. So we'll get into all of these in more detail in a little bit, but that's kind of laying out the position that we can do better for patients and better for research by building a system that is tightly integrating research and care to continuously learn from all patients on all treatments all the time.
Thank you very much, Marty, for these introductory remarks and for your introduction. So, Julian, please take the floor to introduce yourself and to tell us a little bit more about Stand Up to Cancer and share your position.
Thank you, Lisa. I trained as a PhD chemist. I was a medicinal chemist and went into industry and spent 40 years of my career discovering and developing drugs, mostly in oncology. And my last, so I have 4 approved, FDA-approved drugs and 3 additional drugs that are still in the clinical trial and review process. I joined Stand Up to Cancer, a 501c3 not-for-profit charity, about 15 years ago as a scientific reviewer. So that was my spare time. And with my last FDA approval a year ago for bone marrow transplantation, I decided to retire and failed retirement, joining Stand Up to Cancer, initially as its chief science officer, but was quickly demoted this past January to the CEO of Stand Up to Cancer. Stand Up to Cancer, again, is a non-for-profit. We raise money for research. Primarily, we don't do drug discovery, but we do translational research, laboratory research, and early-stage clinical trials. And we really try to advance the field in that way. Having spent so much time in pharma and biotech, I kind of understand that business model, and where the industry fails us is in the detection of early-stage cancer with greater fidelity and the treatment of early-stage cancer, which is going to provide longer-term clinical benefit, including cures. And so that's a new strategy that we're adopting at Stand Up to Cancer. And I'll wait for questions if there's more interest.
Thank you, Julian. Ian, please go ahead.
So I'm Ian Tunnock. I'm, I guess, a semi-retired medical oncologist. I don't treat patients anymore, but I still teach and comment and write about clinical trials. I spent my career at the Princess Margaret Cancer Centre in Toronto, and I'm in Toronto at the present time. And I have an interest in global oncology and in common sense oncology of getting away from small differences to treatments that are really meaningful to patients. So in terms of clinical trials, I obviously don't think that randomized clinical trials are the only way of advancing knowledge about cancer. But I'm also very cognizant that all the drugs that have been developed, sure, people like Julian's drugs, they all add toxicity. And I think we have to be very careful when we start prescribing drugs to patients that there is an appropriate balance between benefit and toxicity. And it's very hard to get that balance without having firm evidence. And I think the best firm evidence does come from randomized controlled trials. It's very hard to exclude bias from non-randomized trials. Marty mentioned pediatric oncology, and I recognize that in rare diseases, we have to use the best evidence available. And pediatric oncology has had the advantage of a very high inclusion of children in terms of sequential therapies. So they've developed in that way. That isn't the case in adult cancers. I think there are many problems with trials, but just a couple of examples of where we could be so greatly misled when we don't do randomized trials. About 25 years ago, there was a huge impetus to use high-dose chemotherapy and bone marrow transplantation for breast cancer. I was one of the few people who was saying, no, we need to test this in a randomized trial. And I can remember being vilified at meetings. And in fact, oncologists were sued for not offering this treatment. It was very toxic. And the proponents were saying, well, it's just so good that you can't do a randomized trial. And then they did the randomized trials. They were negative, and fortunately, no longer. We're not giving women with breast cancer extremely toxic therapy that doesn't work. And the reasons were that there was a huge bias in the way that the patients were selected. So I think we do need randomized trials. There was a lot of imperfections. With respect to pharmaceutical companies, I think the way that the field has been overtaken by pharma-sponsored trials has been a disservice. In my 30 years ago, did trials for prostate cancer that led to drug registration. Well, we started off with needing $1,000 per patient. It went up to about $3,000 or $4,000, but the current price that Marty mentioned is ridiculous, and it's come from a variety of reasons. And unfortunately, there are some companies who've done good trials, but the goals of making a profit and the goals of helping patients are not always concordant, and there's a lot of bias in trials. So there are no doubt there are problems, but to my mind, well done clinical trials which seek to exclude bias, at least for the common diseases, are the best ways of creating the evidence to most appropriately treat patients. And in your Cancer Commons, Marty, I looked at your website and your expert opinions, which I thought was good. But when I actually analyzed those opinions, almost all of those opinions were based on the results of randomized controlled trials by your experts. So I'll stop there for now, and we can come back to some of these points later.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your introduction. Jonathan, please go ahead.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. I'm professor of medical ethics at McGill. So I'm coming at this from the standpoint of an ethicist. What I'm about to say is probably going to seem maybe a little bit more abstract, a little bit more removed, but I think sometimes when you have a little bit more distance and you can sort of, see the big picture, sometimes the ethical issues come more to the surface. So I'm a big fan of clinical trials, and I'm a big fan of randomized trials in fields like cancer. And I want to sort of lay out a couple ethical reasons why I think it's really important to submit drugs to rigorous evaluation in phase 3 trials in the realm of cancer. And these are ethical considerations you probably never really thought about. So there's some obvious ethical reasons, but I want to bring out some ones that are less obvious. So I want to begin with the premise that uncertainty is costly. It's costly for society when we're uncertain what to do. So imagine you have a drug, you're uncertain whether the drug is safe or effective. Turns out the drug is effective, but you don't use it because of the uncertainty. Patients forego an opportunity to benefit from that drug. On the other hand, there's the other type of error that you can make, which is you don't know whether a drug is effective or not. You think you use it, it turns out not to be effective. That's also costly because someone's paid for that drug. The patient that took that drug gave up an opportunity to take another drug that might have been effective. Patients might have been harmed by the side effects of that. So uncertainty is really burdensome, and the task of clinical trials is really to sort of get uncertainty down to a level that is manageable with the maximum level of efficiency. And I'm going to get back later into this idea of trials being inefficient. They're actually the most efficient way to reduce uncertainty, but we'll get to that later. So one of the goals of trials is to reduce or to minimize uncertainty. And as you can imagine, when you run a phase 2 trial, you have high levels of uncertainty. When you get the results of a phase 3, you're reducing that level of uncertainty. And there are a number of reasons for that. Number one, with the phase 3 trial, you have a larger sample size, but also with the phase 3 trial, you're usually measuring the things patients actually care about, survival, rather than the things that are indirect measures of the things patients care about, like tumor shrinkage. And what's more, when you run a phase 3 study, you're usually selecting patients that are much more representative of the patients that will actually take the drug, in contrast with a phase 2 study where they're often stylized patients. Okay, so far so good. Now, what I want to say is that the crux of what drug regulation does, the crux of what approval does when we approve drugs, is it determines how we're going to distribute the costs of uncertainty. So who's going to bear all the burdens of uncertainty that I've described? So let me sort of go through this in 4 different examples of distribution of uncertainty. Suppose we approve drugs at the point of phase 2 clinical trials. We don't go on to phase 3 clinical trials. Who's bearing the risks of that uncertainty? Well, in clinical trials, there's typically a rigorous informed consent process. So these are patients that have some capacity to protect their interests. Now, if you approve a drug after phase 2, you still have that uncertainty, but that uncertainty is now being carried by patients who are not undergoing a rigorous informed consent process. They're getting clinical consent, which, as we know, is basically signing a waiver form. So number one, early approval is shifting the burdens of uncertainty from a class of patients that can protect themselves with informed consent to a class of patients that have much more limited means to protect themselves. Number two, when you run clinical trials, you're typically enrolling the healthiest of the sick patients, right? The patient still needs to meet eligibility, but they need good performance status. So you're trying to find the healthiest of the sick. When you use a drug in clinical practice, that's going out there in the wild, including patients that have a number of other kinds of conditions. So another thing that early approval does is it means that more vulnerable patients, patients who have more comorbidities, are the ones that are going to be exposed to that uncertainty compared with what is going to happen in a clinical trial. Now, the third point, and I realize that there are a couple Americans, on this call, but this matters very much to us Canadians. Who's going to bear the financial risk of uncertainty? If you approve a drug after phase 2, it's no longer the company that's paying for the patients to receive that drug. They're no longer purchasing that, right? It's the healthcare system that's purchasing it. So why should healthcare systems be subsidizing drug companies by paying for drugs for which there's uncertainty about the safety and efficacy? Why wouldn't that be something that's borne by the company that's actually going to be selling the product? So that's another way in which early approval is changing the distribution of the costs of uncertainty. And there's one last point that I want to make, which is that who's bearing the costs of actually resolving that clinical uncertainty? Well, before approval, companies are the ones that are paying for the clinical trials. So they're bearing the costs. They're internalizing the costs in standard economic language. After a drug is approved, companies don't really have very strong incentives to evaluate that drug. Why would they? If the drug's already being used, further evaluation can only be bad news, potentially. So at that point, much of the burden, much of the cost is being shifted onto public research systems or public healthcare systems if we're using real-world evidence. So once again, it's a situation where the uncertainty, it's the same level of uncertainty after approval with whether phase 2 or phase 3, but it's being shifted into a different population. And I think there are really good ethical reasons why that uncertainty ought to be borne by companies and by consenting patients who have given rigorous consent and patients who are less vulnerable. Now, I have a whole other sort of suite of scientific arguments, but I think in the interest of time, I probably used up my 10 minutes already. I'll hold those for later discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. Julian, did you want to comment?
Can you hear me? Yeah, I did want to comment on some of Jonathan's points. First of all, my career has been in the US. I was trained in Canada, by the way. I am Canadian by origin. So I understand there are different healthcare systems. I know the European systems as well. My drugs have been approved internationally, so I've dealt with every regulatory body. What's very important to appreciate is that if a drug has efficacy in a phase 1 study, and you're not taking all comers, but you have a hypothesis, a way to define a patient population. Very often, and this has been more true of the hematologic malignancies, but very often the majority of drugs can be approved on the basis of an accelerated approval in the US or conditional approval in Europe. I'm less familiar with the Canadian rules. But that comes with it a burden to the sponsor that they have to do a confirmatory study. So the drug goes to market, but they have to do a randomized phase 3 study or a phase 4 study, if you will, to address some of those issues of uncertainty that Dr. Kimmel just raised. And so I think I have seen cases where the phase 2 trial leads to an approval, but the phase 3 trial then fails and you have an accelerated withdrawal. And we've seen that for the case of, for example, Avastin or bevacizumab in breast cancer. So the regulatory body is trying to thread the needle between risk-benefit, trying to get drugs to patients, but also has the obligation to protect society at large. There are also requirements now to enroll patients in clinical trials that reflect the demographics of the territory in which we are. So, for example, in the US, we have African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans. We try to get as much representation, even in phase 2 clinical trials, so that we're not just cherry picking the best patients. Ultimately, though, it's a very challenging thing, and it is a very expensive thing to conduct these trials, because at the end of the day, all we are doing is trying to improve probabilities. And I agree very strongly, patients don't just care about tumor shrinkage, they care about quality of life and quality of life with good survival. So I agree with my colleagues across the board on this point.
Thank you, Julian. So we had a comment from Jonathan, then Ian, and then Marty.
Yeah, thanks. So I just want to clarify a couple of points. So, there may be cases I can elaborate on these where approval after phase 2 makes sense. I mean, imatinib is a classic example, Gleevec, where, extremely compelling molecular evidence and clinical evidence after phase 1 and phase 2 for approval. So, what I'm sort of describing here are sort of broad contours, but I do want to sort of make sure to, clarify, it's true that, regulators like FDA maintain policies like accelerated approval. And I, by the way, support these kinds of policies under certain circumstances. But at the point of approval, companies really, FDA has very little authority to sort of compel companies to complete those clinical trials. And there are lots of studies, a lot of them put out by a group at Harvard, there's another group at LSC, that show that often it takes companies a long time to complete those studies. When they're completed, a surprisingly large fraction of them are using surrogate endpoints like tumor shrinkage, not survival. Many of them are not randomized. And what's shocking to me And surprising is many of them are not positive, but the FDA doesn't withdraw approval. In some cases, I've even seen cases where there's a negative result of one of these follow-up confirmatory studies, and the FDA then transitions to full approval of the drug. I never quite understood the reasoning. So anyway, it's true that there is a sort of a protection that's built in with accelerated approval for confirmatory, but there are a lot of flaws in the way that policy is implemented.
Thank you, Jonathan. So Ian and then Marty, please.
Yeah, Jonathan has already made most of the points that I was going to make in response to Julian. I actually think the accelerated approval or conditional approval should be used extremely rarely. Let's face it, I'm a pretty old oncologist, and there's only been 2 or 3 occasions in my lifespan where a drug is so effective, like imatinib or for drugs for testicular cancer, that you didn't need a randomized trial to really show benefit. And those early approvals are based on endpoints that really have very little meaning. There is virtually no correlation between tumor shrinkages and improvement in overall survival and quality of life. And if you want to be cynical, if you shrink the patient at the same rate as the tumor, that doesn't really help them very much. So I think that's bad. The second thing is, when you have that system, it becomes extremely hard to attract patients to a trial where the drug is already available. So no wonder that it's difficult to do the trials. And as Jonathan said, there are many situations where the FDA may have ordered a trial to be done, where the trial is either done poorly or not completed because they can't recruit enough patients. And even when the results are equivocal, it doesn't lead to reversal of the approval. And I think we do need much higher standards. We need to approve drugs. We approved, unfortunately, a lot of drugs that do very minimal things at high price to patients. I mean, we've got some good drugs. Advent of immunotherapy for Marty's disease, for example, has been fantastic. But we're also approving a lot of drugs with marginal differences in surrogate endpoints. And that is where a lot of the waste is going in oncology.
Yeah, to which I might add that the patients who are getting these marginal drugs, there's another opportunity cost that's missed there, which is there are so many trials, and we saw this during COVID, right, which are basically either moot or redundant or not worth doing because they're a Me Too trial. And that just chews up patients that we might otherwise be able to help and learn something from if doctors are free to be able to use the drugs that they have data on. And when I say that, let's not put every patient into a phase 3 trial, if that was possible, maybe I would be okay with it. But 3 to 5%, 0.1% for juveniles who are I need to correct this because every kid is in a trial, but you don't learn too much from those trials. You learn from the kids who aren't in a trial. What do you learn? What do you do for that? There's very, very few patients who are in trials. What do you do for the rest of the patients? How do you give them the optimal benefit, and how do you learn as much as possible from them? And my concern here is that there hasn't been a new drug approved for brain cancer in 20 years. And it's not that there haven't been drugs that have looked very, very promising. There are a number of immunotherapies that have 15, 20% long-term survival in GBM, a disease where basically everyone dies in a year or two. So these drugs are doing something. They're by and large very safe, and they're bioactive, and they're not approved. Why? Because the FDA in the US says, come back when you can tell us which 15 or 20%. Go and do some trials. And most of these do more trials, come back in 3 or 4 years. And most of these drugs are from biotechs that have basically shot their wad with their first trial. They don't have any money left. And so these are drugs that will probably never get to market, and they're just lost to the world. So as an alternative, consider if a drug is safe and bioactive. So it's shrinking the tumor, but we don't know, in fact, whether it's surviving life, right? Put that in the toolkit of the physicians and let them start to experiment the way the AIDS researchers did with combinations of drugs, which is what it's going to take to treat most cancers. And we'll be able to get that 15 or 20% up to 25%, 30%, 40% hill climbing off of the little successes, the toeholds that we get in these diseases. And you can't do that with trials. And you can't do that with the drugs if the drugs can't get to market so you can start using them. So I guess on this respect, I'm a libertarian, right? Right to try. Let the drugs, if they're safe and bioactive, not snake oil, be out there so that the docs can start experimenting. And this is what patients are looking for. And if a patient can sign a consent to bungee jump, off a bridge, why can't they sign a consent to be able to get access to these drugs?
Very interesting comments, and I would encourage our panel to, when you take further comments to respond to each other's points, to probably present your perspective on what is personal good and personal need versus societal need and societal good. And it's very difficult for any individual if that person or that family receives a diagnosis. And it's a very top of the agenda to policymakers who deal with budgets and deal with very, very different realities, and actually researchers who ask very, very legitimate questions about uncertainty, about benefit to the society, and about longer term answers for patients. So on that note, I'm not asking a question, I'm just throwing the comment in terms of personal versus societal. And I would like to give a chance to Silvia Marsoni to ask a question. Silvia, please go ahead. If you could unmute yourself.
Yeah, I know. Sorry that I have to switch from one place to another. Hi, everybody. Actually, I wanted to make a point about the conditional approval, which I think is one of the most terrible devices afflicting clinical trials. There was I don't know if you remember, but there was really an illuminating article on the New England by Pasteur in, I think it was in 2021 or 22, in which they looked back at something like 30, I'm quoting by heart, so bear with me, but something like 30 or 35 CPIs, PD-L1 or PD-1 inhibitors that had received approval, conditional approval, and then they went ahead and did the full-blown clinical trial. And in 10 of them, so 1/3 of those, there was no benefit, neither in the original proxy endpoint or in survival. And that notwithstanding, the drugs was not, the market approval remained intact. So the drugs was continuously sold. I think that this is a practice that really it's not benefiting according to what all the people before me have talked about this. It's really a terrible thing, and we should really make some noise with FDA to go into the direction of really, if they want to keep this this provision, to be then very stiff in the post evaluation of the marketing approval. My second point is really on the fact that why do we do randomized clinical trial? We do randomized clinical trial because the drugs that we're using are not particularly effective, and bias can obscure if we do not randomize what is happening. Nobody, we didn't need to do penicillium, a trial for penicillium, because there is a digital response, and with either you die of pneumonitis, so you didn't at the end of Second World II. In the fields of oncology, To my knowledge, the only really drug that stands to that is rituximab, which was approved on the basis of practically a phase 1/2 trial, because practically 100% of the patient, or slightly less than that were in fourth line and resistant lymphoma patient develop a complete response. And that is actually what then happened to her. So I think that in principle, one cannot say that you really need a rituximab, clinical trial in 100% of the situation. But given the complexity of the heterogeneity of the disease in which we're dealing and the low efficacy of the drugs, 99% of the time, I think that not doing a clinical trial will put us in a very dangerous situation.
Thank you, Sylvia. And I'd like to get a comment from Julian and then back to Marty.
So the US happens to have the most complex healthcare system in the world because there are many, obviously there's the pharmaceutical and biotech industry that's very prominent here, but we have regulators, but then we have insurance. And the country is beginning to address that. The Inflation Reduction Act, in fact, is lowering the cost of about 65 drugs over the next 3 years. So that's a political policy decision that addresses the healthcare burden. My experience with the FDA has been that they are very serious scientists, they're very serious regulators. And when I received accelerated approval for bortezomib or Velcade for multiple myeloma, we had to have also begun the confirmatory trial and have it partially enrolled before we saw accelerated approval. So in that case, I think we were playing by the rules and those rules were enforced. And I think the FDA did its job. Now, is the FDA consistent? No, it isn't. They're human beings with different directors and passage over time and different standards of care. I'll remind the audience, last century, it was all chemo and combinations of chemo. In this century, we've seen targeted therapies, immunotherapies. We're now seeing therapeutic vaccines. So as knowledge increases, we are getting better at defining patient populations, their genetic backgrounds, biomarkers, which are part of just about every clinical trial in terms of translational research. So I agree that it's a very imperfect system, but I'll say this about for drugs that are left on the market, but that don't particularly work, they're not commercial, they're not selling. The insurance companies won't cover them. And they're actually economic failures as well. So it's not just the regulatory body, it's also the payer, which in the US is both private insurers and in the case of Medicare and Medicaid, the government as well. I'd like to mention one other thing. So when a drug gets approved by an accelerated approval mechanism or conditional approval, there are cooperative groups that do randomized controlled large trials globally that can confirm or not confirm the efficacy of a drug. So there are multiple mechanisms. The question is everyone playing by the same rules? And that's the problem because the profit motive is clearly distorting what is in the interest of patients and patients' rights. And that's something that I would invite our medical ethicist colleague to maybe comment on.
Thank you. Jonathan, I'll give you a word in a second. I'd like to go back to Marty. And before I do, I want to make one comment. I think it's quite clear there are two schools of thoughts and there are two, well, there are probably a lot more than two, but maybe in big categories, two types of patients. So let's say a patient who comes to Cancer Commons is, according to, I think what I hear from Marty, is the patient who should not be going to phase 3 trials because that patient might simply not have enough days to live, or simply there is nothing out there that has been shown to work in phase 3 or nothing there is available. So a point of desperation where pretty much all of us maybe try something, just to try. Maybe it works, and it worked for Marty, and I'm sure Marty can share many stories of very, very lucky individuals who went through that unconventional route and won. What we don't know, and maybe Cancer Commons has that statistics, is how many individuals went down that route, and I suspect many of them do not have enough lifespan left to try many different therapies. They may go for the one and it doesn't work. And not that it would probably not work in phase 3 and probably wouldn't work, but in phase 3, those individuals would have provided knowledge to the system. Here, they did not. So, and it's an ethical question once again. So maybe it's a question for Ian and Jonathan to define if there is a patient who should be going through the Cancer Common route and trying something, what are the characteristics of that patient? How rare is that patient? And which patients should not be put through that kind of system, and really support the mainstream research to contribute to the common good and to have their chances maximized, because sometimes comparator works. I know patients are upset being in the comparator arm, but it might be their life-saving plan rather than going for a risky drug. So I'm giving the word to Marty and then to Jonathan.
There have been so many comments. I don't know which to respond to first. But I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. The lady who spoke about concerned about small differences between one drug and another. Yes, you need, of course, trials to be able to tease out those small drugs. But would you rather chew up a bunch of patients to be able to see whether that small difference is there, or rather be able to take a patient who is on their kind of last few shots, as you say, the ones who come to Cancer Commons, and be able to try things that are the best possible thing for that patient, right? A trial is never, is this the best trial for this patient? No one ever asks that. This is medical ethicists talk about that. They talk about, is this patient a good patient for the trial, right? Not, is this trial the best for the patient? So looked at from that perspective, all these trials are unethical. My point is, I would like to be able to give the patient their best possible shot and be able to learn as much as possible in an equipoise situation where we don't know what's the best. Choose the thing that is going to maximize the information. A trial doesn't maximize the information. It's an expensive way of learning one thing that is a hypothesis that was locked in stone, as opposed to, this is the thing that we think is best to help this patient, and one that we can learn the most from if we're not 100% sure. And then every patient in a learning health system is tracked continuously, so that if you see something that's not going the way you want, the field knows about it instantly, not 3 or 4 years later when data is unblinded. So there's a bunch of things we could talk about forever, but I'm going to give someone else a chance here.
But do you have statistics from Cancer Commons, how many patients were lucky to go through the route and actually the therapy worked for them, and how many were not?
Okay, to be honest, you know, the patients that we're getting are very sick. We send a lot of them to trials, by the way, and almost none of those patients get into the trials because of the inclusion-exclusion criteria, which are so strict. So to your answer, I would say, you know, 5 or 10% of patients see a response which is dramatic enough to say this has done some good for the patient. But the point is that based on that research, we can then go out and look for similar patients and be able to rapidly replicate successes, turning a case report into a case series, into a small study, all within the course of a year. And these patients being sick, you get to see if there's some results pretty quickly, because otherwise these patients will be dead in a year. So it's accelerated on multiple fronts, but the key point is continuously capturing data on all patients, all treatments, all the time. And people can run all kinds of experiments in that context.
Thank you, Marty. I'd like to continue that thought in terms of real world data and synthetic data to potentially replacing phase 3 trials is another school of thought. But before we do that, I want to get comments from Jonathan and Ian.
Sure, I'll say a couple things, but let me, before I say something, I want to ask Marty just a really quick question. Is when he talks about real world evidence, do you have in mind this idea of patients being randomized in this learning health system, or are you not, randomization is out of the picture? Patients get to choose what drugs they take, or using randomization?
We're not telling patients what to do. All of our stuff are done under observational protocols. So we're running a registry trial, if you like, but it's a very interesting protocol that threads the needle between observational and interventional, because what we're observing are what patients do and their physicians do when we give them evidence and scientific rationales for what we're recommending. They can choose to do it or not do it, and then we capture that data.
Yeah, understood. Okay, great. Well, let me just say a couple things really briefly. I think Marty and I have a really different view, but I'm right, about the idea of cost effectiveness and trials. I mean, I think that, clinical trials and randomized trials in particular are the most effective way to maximize the amount of information you get per patient exposure to a drug. Why is that the case? Why is it not the case that in real world evidence there's greater cost effectiveness? Well, number one, you're using randomization. So when you use real world evidence, you always have to wonder whether there's a confound in there about patients that are selecting particular drugs. So you can't rule out that uncertainty. Number two, when you're running randomized trials, you are monitoring patients much more carefully, which makes it much more likely you're able to pick up any number of different characteristics of responses. Number three, when you're running clinical trials, typically there are a number of other secondary endpoints, for example, analysis of biopsy tissue, that allows you, even if a drug is ineffective, to begin to look to see whether or not there are subgroups of patients that are responding to the drug. So really, if you want to maximize the amount you learn per patient exposure, it would be in the context of some kind of randomized trial. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of randomized trials that one can use. We can discuss different kinds of approaches, but in terms of cost effectiveness, they're the most cost effective way to get us as quickly as possible from uncertainty to certainty about whether or not this drug is worth using or whether we should throw it away. I want to say one other thing. Go ahead. Do you want to just comment on that really quickly? Because I just want to add one other comment.
Add your point, then I will comment.
Okay, sure. So the last point I want to make is that there's often this perception that, if patients only had access to these drugs, everyone would, patients would live longer, and that FDA is somehow killing patients by preventing drugs from, getting out to patients. But there's just really no evidence to support that. In fact, a number of teams, including my team, we've done meta-analytic studies looking at risk benefit in phase 2 and phase 3 studies. And at least in cancer, there really isn't any benefit of getting access to a new drug compared with the standard of care. And in a lot of other areas, particularly areas that are very difficult to treat, it tends to be that you're better off in the standard of care arm than you are in the treatment arm. So, I would say that, if Marty is, advocating this on behalf of patients getting the best outcomes, I guess I disagree. If he's advocating it in the context of giving patients choice, yeah, it's true. If patients can choose what drugs they get, then there may be some value to giving them the liberty to make their choice, but it doesn't lead to better medical outcomes. At least the evidence doesn't suggest that.
Well, let's see. Number one, you made a point that trials are the most cost-effective way to get something done. We have in brain cancer replicated the major findings of the last 20 years of clinical trials, dozens of clinical trials. And we've done that with less than 1,000 patients over the course of 1 year from our real world evidence. So this was retrospective, right? But the evidence was there as to what worked and what didn't work to what extent, with a much smaller number of patients from real world evidence. The real world evidence that we're capturing is, I wouldn't say every bit as good as what you get in a clinical trial, but I would say substantially as good because if I can coin a term, regulatory grade clinical real world evidence. And by that, I mean being able to do a certain amount of data cleaning and cross-checking. And this is done thanks to the magic of AI fairly automatically. There's still a little bit of curation left. Cancer Commons spun off a company 6 years ago called XCures, which has now done a pretty good job of being able to capture, aggregate, structure, normalize, structure, and summarize a box full of medical records in basically real time. And we can do a lot of synthetic control arms off of that data. It's not at all clear that you say you're biopsying with in trials. We do very, very deep analysis of our patients. They all get whole exome sequencing at least. Some are getting whole genome sequencing in the context of building out neoantigen vaccines. Researchers like to work with our patients because if they have a new test they're developing, they get to be able to test that as well. And we can do analysis in real time continuously to be able to see whether or not something is working or not working. And if it's not working on this patient and they're well enough to get another shot on goal, we try to make sure that they get that shot on goal. And we've had situations where a patient has had 3 or 4 shots on goal over the course of a year, and then finally something was working for them. And that translates from the science point of view into 3 or 4 knowledge turns. So better for patients, better for research, to be able to have a situation in which you're continuously learning from all the patients. And I'm not saying, again, that phase 3 trials don't have a place. They absolutely have a place. But so many trials, as we saw in COVID, are either moot or redundant or someone's vanity project. And it's not ethical for to have a patient go into this trial just because that's the one that's available at this local institution. What is the best trial for that patient? What's the best use of that patient for research? And what's the best use in a global sense? And what's the best way to be able to help that patient? And often it's a combination of things that you just can't do in a trial.
Thank you. Ian, please, can you offer your comments and then we'll go to Julian. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've also got fire alarms in my apartment, but that's the testing. 2 or 3 comments. One, I think, Lisa, coming back to your patient and what should be done. First thing, not all patients should be receiving active treatment. A sensible oncologist needs to spend time to explain the limits of current treatment. And certainly not all patients should go into clinical trials. As somebody said, you should ask not if the patient is fit for the trial, but if the trial is fit for the patient. And that's very true. And as Jonathan said, standard of care is often the best treatment. A third comment was made, I think, by Julian about randomized controlled trials being done by cooperative groups. Well, Chris Booth, who is a close colleague, has traced the randomized controlled trials that have been done over several decades. More than 90%, something like 95% are now sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. There has been a change in endpoints from meaningful ones to surrogate endpoints. So I don't think it's true that the cooperative groups have the capacity to really test drugs that are coming from companies in a more objective way.
Sorry for objecting, but for interrupting. The NIH has a budget for cooperative groups. It's not just pharma. Pharma also does.
Yeah, but they're not doing that many independent trials. And my last comment is, I want to come back to a comment you made, Marty, which you said, why not put the drugs in the toolkit of the oncologist or something very similar to that? We're going back to the Abigail Alliance, which some of you may remember, where Abigail Burroughs was a young woman dying of head and neck cancer, I think, and her father raised lawsuits to try to make the point that drugs not yet approved by the FDA should be made available to dying patients. I think that is an incredibly dangerous scenario to happen. I mean, Jonathan has given the reasons why that isn't a good thing to do from an ethical point of view. And let's face it, I mean, if those drugs can be used willy-nilly by oncologists who are not always the most aware of outcomes, I think we're going to just be we're going to be using a lot of bad drugs to give patients things that are not going to do them good. And I don't want to see us go back to that very dangerous situation.
We're running out of time. I'd like to give a word to Julian and the maybe final question or comment to Sylvia.
Thank you, Lisa. If we really want to make a difference in cancer survivorship and cancer mortality, we really need to invest in research that will detect cancers at the earliest stage and be treating really minimal residual disease. We have tools like surgery and radiation, but we have other interventions, interceptions. And as I said, I work very closely with the vaccine world, and we're going to see next year, we're going to probably see our first therapeutic vaccine approved in melanoma. So if you treat stage 1 and stage 2 disease, your likelihood for overall survival, long-term overall survival, is 80 to 90%. If we're talking about stage 4 disease, it hovers around 5-year survival hovers around 10%. Again, depending, certain diseases are more pernicious than others. But that's what we're talking about. And if we want to change, we need to change the game. We need to invest in research, in laboratory and basic research that will allow us to then, using liquid biopsies, to monitor patients with screening and screening algorithms that will multiplex not just whole exome sequencing, but proteomic data and other data sets. And of course, AI is going to be much better than any human. And so we're just seeing the beginnings of this in terms of AI. But 5 years from now, it will be a much more mature field, and we will witness a reduction in cancer mortality.
Thank you, Julian. Sylvia, one final comment from you?
Yeah, thank you. 3 comments. The first one to Marty. I am a truly believer in a way of what this fantastic tool of artificial intelligence will allow us to do in real world situation. And what I think, however, is that the level of knowledge that we know about the disease in this very moment will not allow us to really do what you are suggesting. I've done phase 1 for a long time in my life, and the going in blind to give a drug to a patient, well, in blind, not really in blind, but with a good reason for giving that patient that drug, results in particularly sick patients that are in the 3rd or 4th line of treatment in a very, very low response rate, and certainly not in a survival advantage. So the future might be different, as Julian said, but for the time being and for the majority of the world, you're thinking about what you're doing in a very selected numbers of institutions that has a very high technological armamentarium, including the possibility of going through a lot of HAD data. So it's the future possibly, but for the time being and for a certain amount of time, it's not yet there, in my opinion. Second point that Julian made, which I think it's the real crux of the matter, which is we need to get into much more into the adjuvant and the stage 1 and 2 stage, because there is where you can close the corral before the horses are out. If you close the corral after the horses, i.e. the metastases are out, there's nothing you can do. And on that, liquid biopsy is really going to make a paradigmatic change in everything. I've done one trial on this intervention and figured out that, for instance, we're treating patients with colon cancer stage 2 and 3 that really do not have metastatic disease. They are not micrometastatic, even if phenotypically identical to the one that are metastatic. And they are the majority. I'm talking about 70% of the patient. And these 70% of the patient, which are millions worldwide every year, are getting toxicity that is totally not necessary because they do not have a metastatic disease. And we should remember that with the exception of brain cancer, every other cancer, it's only lethal to the patient if metastatic. If not, there is no reason. You remove it and that's it. Finally, I think that, again, with Julian, I pick a fight a little bit about FDA. I have no doubts that FDA people and scientists are very good, but I think that FDA also probably has caved some time to the, perhaps it's very hard, but to the political pressure or pharmaceutical industry. Again, I'm quoting a paper that was published by a multinational group of people in which they looked at the 145 oncology drugs developed in the last 20 years, from 2020 to 2020. And of those, there were 96 in solid tumor, 16 in leukemia lymphoma. Incredibly, but 71 of these 145 drugs were approved without a randomized clinical trials and without a biomarker, which was your point, in 50% of the cases. So we're still using and applying an old paradigm of how to develop drugs into a new situation of drugs that needs a different approach. Although I don't know how to do it yet. We are in a gap of knowledge and in a gap of methodology because of the introduction of AI and real world that is really, really interesting. I'm really sorry that I'm so old that I will not see how this thing is going to end up. But I think that this kind of discussion is really something that we should do more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Looks like we do need to schedule the discussion 2.0, but to wrap up, I'd like to give 30 seconds to Ian, Jonathan, and Marty if you want to offer any final comments. Completely optional, but do go ahead if you would like to make some final points.
No, I don't think so. I think we've had points from both sides, but I think we need randomized control trials. We need better randomized control trials, and they're not suitable for all patients. But I think the points have been made.
Thank you.
And I would simply say that for patients who are at the end of their life, which is the patients I see, or in the last year of their life, we need to find a way to take advantage of the opportunity to try things, to try to help those patients, and in the process, learn much more than one can by taking years to be able to test one hypothesis. There are thousands of drugs that are out there today that no one knows the optimal way to use to treat cancer. And that trials can't work for. You need to have a system that effectively learns from all patients on all treatments all the time. And that's what Cancer Commons is trying to build in the context of patients first. Flip the paradigm. So there is trials, but they're about curing patients, not approving drugs.
Thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. Very valuable points, different points of view, lots of valid and forward-looking ideas. So we look forward to seeing everyone in about 2 weeks, and this recording will be online tomorrow. So thank you very much, everyone, and in particular our distinguished speakers. Have a good evening. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.